Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week, I'm your host, Charles Max Wood, and we are talking to Mike McQuaid. Mike, you came on before. We talked about Homebrew and building Homebrew and Workbrew and all the stuff you were doing at the time. Is there anything else you want people to know about by way of introduction? Or
Yeah, not really. All the same old stuff. Like, I'm not kind of doing as much stuff on Workbrew nowadays. I'm doing even more stuff on Homebrew nowadays. So yeah, all good stuff. Nothing really has changed.
Good deal. I use Workbrew. I use Homebrew all the time. So
yeah, glad
it's
to
pretty
hear it.
handy. It runs on Linux too, I think. I think I wound up using it there somewhere.
Yeah. It runs on Linux, and I guess because it's Linux, but we've still got a few tweaks there as well on like WSL on Windows as well. Mm-hmm. So I've ended up playing around with it on my like Windows gaming machine, which until recently has been unsullied by Homebrew.
Unsullied, I love it. Yeah, we talked quite a bit about Homebrew and how it works last time, and I thought it'd be interesting because I find myself sometimes fiddling with like writing scripts or things like that on my machine, and then thinking, it wouldn't be too bad to kind of parlay this or these set of scripts into like a CLI. And so I was just curious. I don't even know where to start with that, but since you've kind of built a CLI that a lot of people use, I know you had other contributors, but let's say that I'm sitting on some stuff that I think belongs in a CLI. Where would you even start with something like that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because I think a lot of this depends on, I guess, like a lot of stuff in tech, right? Is like, what does your scaling story look like, right? To be one of those boring people of like, if it's just something that you're writing for yourself to run it once and throw it away, then, thinking about like the language you use, like you just want to reach for whatever is the most familiar to you. Or right. I guess increasingly nowadays, like whatever you think ChatGPT can one-shot a reasonable approximation of what you want it to do, and then you can tweak it before you run it. But yeah, so
I do that way more than I care to admit.
Oh, for sure. Days. I mean, it's great because I feel like there's a lot of stuff around that where there's like scripts that previously we just wouldn't have written, and then now just being like, hey, I want to pull this data from the GitHub API, and previously they'd be like, it's possible, but do I really want to spend like 2 hours on this? And then it's now like, well, I'll spend 20 seconds asking ChatGPT and look at the output, and if it's wrong, then it doesn't matter. But yeah, so I guess that's the first thing is so for me personally, like I tend to reach for like the smallest, dirtiest, filthiest scripts for Bash because I'm pretty comfortable in Bash. Bash has like a huge amount of gotchas though, so as soon as it becomes even slightly load bearing, even for you, you probably want to go to like no offense, Bash authors like a real language. And at that point, stuff's pretty interchangeable. Like if we're on a Ruby podcast, so like Ruby is really good for like standalone single file CLI scripts. That's what I would tend to kind of go for straight away. If you're a Python person, Python's pretty good for that type of stuff as well. I think like, if people don't have familiarity with those, I'd be surprised if they listen to a Ruby podcast, but then, I'm sure you can probably do equivalent stuff in C# and various other more obscure languages. But like, I guess that's where I would tend to go next, is just be almost like, okay, how can I put it in a single script? And you can do some kind of neat stuff with, most people are familiar with Bundler for installing dependencies, but then most people are also like, okay, like Bundler, I have to do like bundle install and bundle exec and all this type of stuff. But actually you can do some cool stuff with Bundler where you can actually define a gem file inside the script itself. So the first thing it does is checks for all its dependencies and installs them all. So that can be, again, quite a nice way of extending some little basic scripts.
Yeah, I just want to back up on that for a minute. Please. Because I ran into that somewhere. I can't remember where, but yeah, it's just its own little syntax in there, isn't it? What exactly do you have to do in order to
I can't remember the exact syntax off the top of my head, but yeah, basically like, I mean, that's the nice thing about the state of Bundler and Ruby in 2025 is if you're installing a even vaguely modern Ruby, it's going to come with a vaguely modern Ruby gems and Bundler out of the box. And then everything essentially you can do through the CLI, you can also do through the Ruby APIs instead. And that means that essentially every input that you would previously have pass in as a parameter, you can pass in as a string, or like your gem file, instead of reading it from disk, you can like have that be like a here doc in your Ruby script or whatever it might be. Yeah, like, so that's a nice way of getting there. So like, that's what I will tend to do, is have like a little bit at the top of maybe one of my scripts that's like, hey, if I need this particular gem, then install this gem at the first time it's run. And then I don't need to like carry around the script and a gem file and whatever, but I can just run it wherever I need to and however I need to.
Yeah, I did find it. You require bundler inline, and then you do gem file do, and then you basically put all your gem file stuff in there. So you do your source, which is probably rubygems.org, and then you gem whatever, and yeah, you just use your the domain specific language for the bundler for the gem file.
Yeah,
and off it goes. It's pretty cool.
So then when your script's getting a little bit more, I guess, load bearing, as we were saying as well, like that might be when you want to be like, hey, I want to have some like options parsing. And like the most basic way of doing that is just, you've got the argv like array, and you can go and say, okay, what's the first parameter, second parameter? But if you want to handle flags and switches and being passed in different orders, there's like the Ruby, again, part of the standard library. There's the Ruby kind of option parser library, which is pretty good, pretty easy to use. If you're still in bash land, there's like sort of a bash equivalent, but in my mind, even by the time I start getting towards like multiple argument parsing, it's like, that's again a nice sign that I probably want to go into Ruby and use that kind of richer library. And there's also various gems that provide different DSLs for whatever your preferences are in that area.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know a lot of people also use Optimist. It used to be called Trollop.
Yep.
If you're been around for a while and it's like Optimist, it's the same thing. Do you have a preference?
It's funny because I tend to use just the most basic, like I'm going to pull stuff out of argv until it hurts. I think it's also because I've been around in Homebrew and Ruby and whatever like long enough. It's like I'm aware of all of the kind of edge cases that you get there. And like, if you delete a random part of argv, or if you dupe it, or if you check for inclusion, like what the various gotchas are. So like, I wouldn't necessarily recommend other people do what I do. But I guess I don't have a particular library of that I prefer for this stuff. And Homebrew, because for a very long time, Homebrew kind of couldn't really by design use any Ruby libraries without fully vendoring them all, which was a big pain for us. Like Homebrew basically built its own argument parser and stuff like that. Even today, like Homebrew, we're a little bit, I wouldn't say suspicious of other libraries, but it's like we care. I guess this is a nice segue to the next thing you might start caring about with the CLI, which is like Homebrew nowadays, we really care about like the runtime and almost like how long is it going to take to essentially, do the thing that you want it to do. So like how long until you can print a hello world once you have all your libraries loaded and everything like that. And I think that's the type of thing where, like, if you have a script that you run once a month and it takes 30 seconds to run, you probably don't care if it takes 5 seconds or 30 seconds or a minute, right? Like but if you have a script that you're running in your shell prompt, say, and then your shell's not going to be your shell prompt's not getting it printed until the script completes, all of a sudden, you maybe don't want to require that library. You maybe want to do it by hand so that you can just boost it. Or you may well be getting towards the point which Homebrew is not quite able to do, but some of the other CLIs I built more recently, I guess like at Workbrew and at GitHub or whatever, it's like, okay, you maybe want to reach for another language at this point. So Ruby is really good language. There's been a lot of performance optimization work that's gone into Ruby in the last 5 or 10 years, but a lot of that comes from the Shopifys and the GitHubs who are not focused on how can I make a CLI run as fast as I possibly can, but they're focused on like, how can I have a long-lived Ruby process realistically running probably Rails or Sinatra or whatever, which can serve as many requests as possible as quickly as possible, right? So that has more performance implications around like memory management and garbage collection and JIT and stuff like that, and things which rewards the longer execution of the application,
Right.
which is the exact opposite of what a CLI does, unfortunately. Some things like Rubicop have kind of got around that by having, I forget what they call it, but there's basically a mode where you can essentially have Rubicop sitting in the background and you end up sending requests to an already running process. I guess we could maybe take that approach with Homebrew one day, but we've not yet. So instead, we're generally concerned about like how can you shave that time down? How can you require as little as possible and push some logic into maybe Bash in Homebrew's case? But when you're writing like a proper CLI, then that's, that looks like maybe nowadays probably the best choices would be something like Rust or Go, depending on your preferences. Like Go, for example, is, if you're used to Ruby, it's a very sad language, I think, to write because you cannot be expressive.
I'm learning Go right now, so.
Yeah, I mean, so how have your experiences been with that? About like going from the delights of Ruby land to Go land with the stuff?
Yeah, I don't love it. I mean, I'm just barely getting into it. They use it at work, so back-end engineer encompasses Ruby and Go. Yeah, and mostly I get away with not doing a lot of Go, but yeah, they kind of expect and need you to. So,
yeah, it's, I don't know. I feel like there's definitely been several schools of languages where the underlying methodology is like stop people from doing stupid stuff, and Ruby feels like it's almost as far on the other extreme as you can do, where it's like you can. I mean, I'm sure you've reviewed some absolutely heinous Ruby code over the years where people have taken metaprogramming to an absurd Rube Goldberg level where it's impossible to figure out what's going on. But that also allows you to build incredible DSLs really and Rails stuff, and all of this stuff, right? In Go, I'm sure you have the same, Charles. I just end up feeling like, this like 20-line switch statement could be one line of code in Ruby, but you don't let me have the, you've taken away the keys to this particular car, so I guess I have to write the 20-line switch statement.
Yeah, I just have to say, I mean, to a certain extent, like control flow and things like that, it's all the same. There's some funky stuff with like variable assignment and functions and things like that. But yeah, it doesn't light up my soul like Ruby does. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Like Go feels in many ways to me like a sort of much less verbose Java. Like I wrote a bunch of Java back in the day when it was peak Java enterprise beans and, all of this like excessive boilerplate. And there's a lot less of the boilerplate in Go, but it still feels like there's non-zero amounts. But yeah, so as I say, I would still consider reaching for Go for a CLI if you really care about that like execution performance. Yeah. So for example, I guess when I was at Workgroup previously, I was working on the CLI there, which wrapped around Homebrew CLI. So we wanted to provide as little overhead as possible. And the amount of stuff you can do in 0.1 of a second on modern hardware in Go compared to Ruby is like fairly spectacular. Like in Ruby, you're really trying to make sure you avoid like any IO or significant computation or anything like that. Whereas Ro, just because of the virtues of it being like a natively compiled language, you can just do an awful lot of stuff much faster. And like the multi-threaded story as well is like, because it's not the global interpreter lock, or I can't remember if that's the Ruby name, but whatever the Ruby equivalent is, you can afford to just lean into the concurrency a lot harder.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's say that I want to build a CLI. And I'm trying to think of like a super fun example. Let's say that I'm gonna get an OpenAI API key, and I'm gonna make it talk to whatever, right? So, maybe it'll talk to multiple services there, right? So I'm doing stuff maybe with the podcasts, which is kind of what I'm imagining, right? So I hand off my audio or video to Whisper, and it bada bing, I got a transcript. Right. And then maybe I hand the transcript off to the LLM and it does some stuff. A lot of this stuff, I mean, you would put on the back of like a Rails app or anything else too, right? But, I want a command line interface just to make it super easy for me to kind of navigate through some of this stuff. Where would you recommend I start?
Yeah, I mean, like for me, with stuff like that, in some ways, that's a kind of general question about like, how do you build software, right? And I'm sure everyone has different views, but like, the way I've always liked to do it is essentially just try and write the well, I'll give my pre-AI answer first. My pre-AI answer is essentially just write the filthiest, hackiest code, assuming that no one will ever read it, to just get the core thing done. So I guess in your case, it's like, okay, I want to...
Yeah, I would write a script and I would point the...
I'm not going to do any argument handling. I'm just going to assume an argument has been passed. I'm going to pull out the first argument. I'm going to get the file, maybe the MP3 file or whatever from the podcast on disk. I'm then going to load that into memory. I'm then going to pass that off to OpenAI's transcription API. I'm then going to pull down the result of that as like JSON or whatever. Then I'm going to immediately get that, not store it anywhere, stick that into OpenAI's like LLM API, do something with that, bring that down, and then print the output, right? And essentially build it in such a way that there's no error handling. If anything is in any way not the happy path, then it will fail with a completely incomprehensible error message, right? So like generally that's the way I like to feel out how to do things initially. And like I think sometimes with like CLIs and stuff like that, it can be tempting to be like, oh, I'm going to add the options first, you know, because that's, if you're almost like thinking from like top to bottom, that might be how you would think about it. But actually like that's not really probably the thing you cared the most about. You're trying to figure out, is this thing even viable or useful or whatever? And every minute you spend fiddling with options is a minute you're not figuring that out, right?
Right. Not doing the core thing. That makes sense. And then, so one thing that I'm looking at is, so then do you just build the CLI around it so that you can say transcribe file name?
Yeah.
Or do
exactly. So I again, with this type of stuff, like I tend to go for like, keep everything in one file, like until it starts falling over, right? And I would, again, to start with, not even necessarily use any methods until I'm thinking about making things kind of dry and, you know, I'm having to call the same thing multiple times or whatever, right? So I just would tend to do that until it feels like it's getting too much. I don't know what that is, whether that's, you know, a couple hundred lines, 500 lines, 1,000 lines, whatever, right? And then start splitting it up. As you said, if you had commands, like say you're passing like a transcribe command to do this, or a read out loud command, or a, you know, start a chat command or whatever, then that might be when I'm like, okay, well, logically, there's like 3 different things this is doing. Probably the code between them is not actually that similar. So maybe these could all split out into separate files that are stored a bit separately and included separately and whatever. And again, that's one of the pros and cons of kind of Ruby and Go and stuff like that, because in Ruby, okay, you've got those different files, but you've now, once you split it into multiple files, like if someone else is like, oh, cool script, how can I use it? Then it goes from being like, here's literally like the copy and pasted script contents, to being like, you need to clone this repo and here's how you run it.
Ask this.
Yeah, exactly. So like, okay, you could like make it a gem and then they could gem install it. But like, I'm showing my Homebrew maintainer bias here, but I personally, I really like Ruby gems and equivalents in other languages for like, I want a library. I'm writing Ruby. I want a library for Ruby.
Right.
I kind of resent it when I'm like, I want to install a tool that just happens to be written in Ruby. I don't actually care what language this tool is written in.
Right.
And I have to use npm or gem or pip or whatever to install just some random CLI. Like for me, I would always either reach for Homebrew, or if it's just something my mate wrote, ideally my mate just like sends me the script and I have like a dumping ground repo and I just like copy and paste that file into my repo, and then I can run it or modify it as I choose in future.
Right. So that was that. Yeah. You're talking around one of the things that I was going to ask, right? Because if it's just one file, it's like, okay, stick this in your path, make it executable, bam, you're done. Right. But if it's multiple files, I was trying to figure out, okay, how do you package that? And I guess, you could use something like Homebrew, or I agree with you on if it's a Ruby specific tool like Rake, I don't really have a problem with it being in Ruby gems. But like I've used other CLIs. I think it's like the Heroku CLI or the Stripe CLI. I can't remember, but one or two of those, it was like, I had to go NPM install it. And I'm going, but this is not a code tool.
Yeah.
And that's, I agree with you there. It's like, no, this belongs in Homebrew or apt or Yum or, whatever your package manager is for your operating system, where it's going to pull it in and say, hey, this is a utility you're going to use for other things, right? It's an application essentially that runs on top of your OS.
And as this
But
is
yeah,
a Ruby podcast, it feels like a safe space to admit this. But yeah, like my one is like NPM, where it's like ideally I don't have Node.js on my system at any given time,
Yeah.
right? So like when something says like, oh, the way to do this next step, like step 1, npm install X, and so well, actually there was a step 0 which was install Node.js.
install Node.
And and given that this thing that you're asking me to do is nothing to do with JavaScript, like.
Yeah.
I don't see why I have to do that, right? So often I'm like, okay, I then go looking and I'm like, oh, is this already in Homebrew? And if not, maybe I package it in Homebrew for my own benefit and other people in the future or whatever. But yeah, I've always felt that's the kind of, I think you've brought up a bigger question there about almost like distribution. And I think that's a bit more kind of messy and complicated because it ends up being like, well, what is the distribution method? And Homebrew, somewhat infamously, I think it might be one of the first, maybe even the first to the whole like curl to bash installer script that everyone is much derides. But like, you know what? If you're installing something, exactly, it works. But also like if you're trying to install something that's kind of like non-trivial, like Homebrew that involves cloning a repo, and you know, again, it's like the npm install, like we could say, okay, well, step 1, git clone. And so, well, I don't have Git on my machine. It's like, okay, well, you need to install Git. How do I do that? Well, install Homebrew. like, you know, well, whoops.
Yeah, I guess that's my issue, right? Is I generally have Node and npm on my machine, right? I'm working in Rails, you know, I need some kind of JavaScript runtime. And so it's like, okay, this feels weird, but I'll do it. But yeah, if it's a pip install, because I never touch Python, or, you know, if it requires Go or something like that. Now, these days I'm working on Go, but yeah, it's like, why do I have to install a programming language in order to get my tool when it doesn't really have anything to do with the programming language? And so, yeah, just getting into, you know, that step, I guess some of these come like self-packaged, or when you do the install, then it'll, you know, behind the scenes, it'll install either a standalone version of the language or give you some way of building it on your machine. Or sometimes it's just an executable that's pre-built that, you know, it has reasonable assumptions about what's already there.
Yep.
And so that works. But yeah, so let's say that I am building a CLI. I write it in Ruby. You know, yeah, I mean, I can tell my friend to go git clone it, right? If they're a programmer. And, you know, and then it's like, okay, here's the command to run it. But yeah, let's say that it's something that's getting wider adoption and it needs that distribution, right? Where it's, hey, you know, you're going to go run this on your own machine, right? Maybe it's a fancy CLI that cleans up large files on my hard drive or something like that, right? It's some other utility that does some of these other things. You know, it's helpful, and I don't need a UI for it, or at least not a complicated UI. Big graphical UI. Yeah. How do I begin to package that up?
Yeah. So again, probably unsurprisingly, my natural response to that is like Homebrew is pretty good. Distributing software, right? So with Homebrew, you can kind of stick it in a repo and then call like brew create -- Ruby, point that at the repo, and then Homebrew will try its best to figure things out. But then, you know, if it can't, you can fiddle with that, and Homebrew can help you with that. And you know, if this is a thing that's pretty widespread use and you're packaging someone else's software or whatever, then you could submit it to the main repository and chances are it will be accepted fairly quickly, and then everyone can benefit that. If not, we have this thing called taps, which are like third-party repositories, basically, that you can run a command, brew tap new, which basically will create a new tap for you. You can then push that up to GitHub as a repo, and we spit out some nice CI workflows, so you can use those free public repo actions minutes to put them to use. And then you could use that as your distribution method if you want instead. And then that could be a nice way of, you know, regardless of what language you write it in, if you're doing Ruby or Python or Go or whatever, then you can distribute your software that way pretty easily.
So if there's any kind of setup or build step or anything like that, is there some version of like an install script or something that it runs? Or
Yeah. So there's like in Homebrew's Ruby formula, which is kind of like our DSL for like building and installing software, basically. There's like an install method, and basically you can, much like in normal Ruby, you can run a bunch of system commands in there. Like we try and do a reasonable guess of like, hey, if it's a Ruby project, you probably want to run like bundle install and then, you know, stick a Ruby file in a bin directory somewhere, and that probably gets you most of the way there. But it's basically just like little nice DSLs that can kind of help you get that software onto your machine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the nice things about Homebrew is it's definitely, of most of the packaging systems I've ever interacted with, and from what I hear from people, it's one of the easiest to just get started with, like an existing piece of software. Because essentially you're just like, okay, run some commands, which you can try yourself in Bash, and then move stuff from one place to another, and then that's you.
So, I mean, in the case of Ruby, Homebrew already runs Ruby. But let's say that I reach for something like Go or Rust, or maybe I'm using Python, right? And so I can't assume that the person whose machine it's going to get installed on has, the language or language tools that I need in order to build and run it. How do you manage that kind of a thing?
Yeah, so in Homebrew, we just have like a little line, again, with our DSL called depends on, where you can basically say, okay, I need Ruby, or this particular version of Ruby, or whatever it may be. Where it gets a bit more fun.
And it installs that globally?
Yeah. So it would install that, but Homebrew keeps track of, okay, did you ask me to install this? So say we have your OpenAI transcription thing, call it Transcribey or whatever, right? And you might install it with brew install Transcribey. So that would install Ruby automatically because that's what you said. But then in a year, you're like, Ruby sucks or whatever. I'm going to rewrite this in Go. And then you switch your packaging over to Go. Then Homebrew knows when you ran brew install Transcribey, you weren't saying, hey, can I have Ruby and Transcribey? You were I just care about Transcribey. I don't care what Transcribey is written in, right? So then if it changes in future to Go, then Homebrew then knows like, oh, well, you never asked for Ruby. We don't need Ruby anymore. Let's get rid of Ruby, right? And again, the fun thing with Go, as an example, is like, and this is where it gets slightly different. I won't go into the details unless you're really interested, of like, if you're building it yourself versus if Homebrew builds it for you. But if Homebrew builds it for you, then the nice thing about Go is because Go spits out binaries, then you don't even need to install Go on your system. Right. You can probably use the binary that we have built for you. So then you can get rid of Ruby. You don't need Go. We need to install Go when we're building it for you in our servers. But on your system, you don't need Go unless you're building it from source, as we would say.
Right. Similar with Rust.
Yeah, exactly.
And it seems like with the approach that we're taking with Ruby or Python or something that's not compiled that way, or Node is another example, right? Yeah. If it's running on any of those, the install Node or install Python or install Ruby approach works fine on Linux or Mac, or in the USL.
Yeah.
WSL, whatever it is. I am not a Windows. I help my wife with Windows, but she's not using the Linux emulator. So, but yeah, so that works fine there. And then if you need to package it up for something like Windows, then you're looking at another tool that's going to essentially package your language, right? It's going to put your Ruby VM in the executable so that it can run.
Yeah, so that's when it starts to get a bit more messy, and different languages are optimized for that. So again, like going right back to our original, like I'm writing a CLI. So I think like one of the first questions I would probably have is like, what are the chances are that you're going to want to ship this to Windows users, right? And if unless the chance is definitely not, then Ruby and Python, and even more so things like Bash, are, very easy to get started across Windows and across Linux and Mac OS from the outset. But then when you have like a Windows story, that's when it starts to get a bit more messy. Like Windows has, again, like plenty of package managers and stuff like that, but your average Windows user is not going to be familiar with those. And even a lot of Windows developers don't necessarily use like package management as widespread as it is in the Linux and Mac OS worlds. So that's when I would say like the story that Go, for example, can do for you is, I'm less clued up on Rust in this way. So I might, excuse me, any Rustians who are listening, that I might not know quite as much about what Rust is capable of. But certainly I know with Go, the nice thing is you can just build a single binary, which you can then have run on a Windows machine, and that will work as expected, right? But the other nice thing with Go is it's the cross compilation story is very easy. So even if you only have access to a Mac machine, you can build the binary on your Mac for all macOS versions essentially, and Linux and Windows. And if you don't have access to those operating systems, you can have reasonable degree of confidence that unless you're doing kind of wacky OS specific stuff, that binary will just run fine on all three OSs.
Mm-hmm.
And like that's a pretty appealing thing if you're building a CLI that you want to be used cross-platform.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm a little curious getting into running it on Mac versus Linux. Like, it seems like for the most part, things just generally work the same way. Are there meaningful differences that you need to be aware of in certain cases?
Yes. I think most of the time you don't need to think too hard about things. And I think it's often relatively obvious when you're sort of starting to get a little bit more detailed. So, for example, one difference would be we're going to really nerd out on some nice OS, high level OS internals here. But, like macOS and Linux run different kernels, right? There's the Linux kernel and the macOS Darwin kernel. And then there's the stuff in user space as well. So because, as you mentioned, like macOS came from like a BSD kernel land, most of the user space applications are BSD. And on Linux, most of the user space applications might be GNU ones, right? And Apple won't use those because of GPL-v3, which is a whole other long and very boring conversation. But so basically, like, if you're calling out to various, say, like even grep, right? Grep has arguments that will work on macOS and they will not work on Linux in the same way, and vice versa. So you might, if you're shelling out to grep, you might need to have like conditional logic based on the OS you're on. Or alternatively, instead of shelling out to grep, you just say, okay, I'm going to instead like get all the lines and I'm going to iterate over the lines in Ruby and do things that way too. So I think with like writing Ruby itself, like Ruby and Python are both generally written in such a way that like pretty much everything you would ever try and do is going to be cross-platform by default.
Right.
It's just various little gotchas like shelling out, or again, can't remember if this is still the case in 2025. I'm pretty sure it is, but like by default, Linux generally ships with Linux issuers ship with a case-sensitive file system, and macOS ships with a case-insensitive file system. So if you're doing all your development on Mac and you have like some file that you read in from your repository or whatever, and it's uppercase A, anteater with an uppercase A versus anteater with a lowercase a, that will work just fine on macOS if you're inconsistent between the repo data on disk and how you've written in your source code, but then on Linux that might blow up, right? So like these are the types of little things that you need to care about when you're doing cross-platform development.
Gotcha. So I'm just trying to think through the rest of it. I'm imagining that, if I split things up into files, what it's going to do is it's going to put all of my files into one place, put the executable in the path somewhere, and then the executable is going to be aware of where the things are and just have that in the load path, essentially.
Exactly.
Now, with testing, are there specific things that you do when you test them, or do you just kind of test the internal logic and assume that your flags and stuff work?
Yeah, so that's a good question as well, because I think, particularly if you've never really written in CLI before, you would probably think, particularly once you get to like the multiple files level of like, okay, I'm going to write a bunch of unit tests for the internals and make sure that they work. My experience as a long-time CLIer is that like actually that is going to cause you a lot of pain unless you have at least some tests that are actually shelling out and running the script externally, right? We, I guess, relatively recently in Homebrew, which in my mind is probably like 10 years ago, but that's recent as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, so we used to have a lot of tests that were just, unit tests. And then we would just find that like really core functionality would break because all the internal APIs were working, it's the tale is all this time with like unit tests versus integration tests, right? Of like, you can have all of your internal APIs working perfectly and are beautifully tested, but then when you fit them all together, things explode. Yeah. So as a result, like I've always found with CLIs in particular, like really taking that sort of outside in testing approach is really nice to ensure that you're like, okay, so say again, we're talking about this OpenAI CLI type thing. Like if I was writing a CI pipeline to test that, I would probably give GitHub Actions my, like, either my or a test OpenAI key, and I would have it in CI, like actually trying to run a transcribe command on maybe like a single word or some very short amount of input data, and actually making sure that as close to a real use of that application is actually being tested and working as expected. Because all the kind of clever, like all the clever unit tests you might have will just otherwise fall over when you need them the most.
Yep. I like it. Makes sense. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so another thing you might find, I guess, as I've been talking about like CLI performance, because it's often in front of my mind with this stuff. So there's a guy who's written loads of really helpful little CLIs in Rust. I forget his name off the top of my head, but we can find him, Google him later or whatever. So he's got a really nice tool he's built called Hyperfine, which is a CLI benchmarking tool, basically. It does a bunch of other things, but that's what I've found it most useful for. So what that does is it takes this sort of outside-in approach, and you can say like, hey, I want you to run this command this many times and then tell me like what the performance characteristics are. Or I want you to run this command and tell me the difference between the two. So quite often when I'm doing like Homebrew performance work, the way I will measure the performance differences is like that command could include like checking out a branch, or you should specify that as like a preparatory command or whatever. So I'll say, okay, check out this branch, run this Homebrew command, then check out this branch, run this Homebrew command. And then it just has a nice little display of almost like, well, when you run this command, it's 1.4 times faster on average. And that varies by like 2%, like across the iterations. And I think it runs it 10 times by default, but you could say, run this 1,000 times or 2 times or whatever. And there's like, as you might expect for kind of a beautiful, like proper CLI nerd CLI like this, there's like so many different options to twiddle every possible knob to get it to work exactly how you want it to. But if you're ever in a world where you're like, I really care about the performance implications of my CLI, like that is the best tool I've ever used and works basically exactly how I want it to, because it does that inside out testing, right? Of like actually running the actual process and then measuring the actual time that like it runs for. So big shout out to Hyperfine.
Yeah, I found it on GitHub. It's David Peter and or Shark DP is his GitHub handle. And looks like a cool tool. Because I wanted to switch gears a little bit.
Yeah, please.
So I wound up on your blog when I was getting ready for the episode, and you have an article on here, and we wound up talking about AI, and it seems like it's still the hot topic. It's funny because over the last, 3, 4, 5 months, I've really started to use AI quite a bit. Sometimes I use it essentially to write most of the code. And then I have people, get concerned about whether AI is going to take people's jobs and things like that, which you address in your article here. It says open source maintainers thrive in the LLM era. You address some of that and you talk about how people are using LLMs and things like that. I'm just wondering, like, what's your experience using LLM tools like Cursor or Copilot? And then the other question I have is, and you kind of address it here, is there any hope for the people that are freaked out that AI is going to take their programming job?
Yeah. So I guess I'll make sure I get to both of those. But I guess the experience-wise, I've been probably using some sort of tools in some sort of capacity since the very early days. So like back when Copilot was still an internal alpha at GitHub based on, I think, GPT-2 to start with.
Yeah.
And OpenAI had publicly not really done anything except released a bunch of papers. Yeah, like I was asked to test it internally, essentially. And like I was known for being the type of person who was good if you wanted honest opinions of the things I was testing. Because regardless of the political consequences, if you asked me to test something and I thought it was total trash, I try and be nice about it. But like I would not tell you that it was great. I would tell you that it was not great. But yeah, so I remember trying this and being like, this will, because I'm sure people, it's almost hard to even remember, but like if you put yourself back in whatever this was, like 2021 or something like that, like, if someone had described what you're able to do now with Copilot or Cursor and they said, I built a thing that does this, you would be like, your eyes would roll out your head, and then you'd be like, okay, like, yeah, whatever. Like, I've seen a lot of autocomplete. Like, it always sucks. It just gets in the way. It's annoying. It's not useful. Like, I write Ruby now. The autocomplete in Ruby sucks. I don't really care, and I don't really miss it anymore because I've got used to it, and whatever. This is just nothing that I care about. Right. And I tried it, and like, my almost immediate reaction was like, even when it was way more limited, was like, wow, this is not like radically transformative yet. This is not incredibly workflow changing yet, but this is really good. And this is a lot better than I expected. And ironically, you could build a pretty damn good autocomplete without any specific knowledge of Ruby as a language, but just using this kind of LLM technology. Right. And I said to the team, I was like, yeah, I assumed this would be complete garbage, and it's actually good. Well done. Like, can I keep using this, please? So yeah, so I guess I went from that to using Copilot.
I just want to chime in. That kind of lines up with my early experience with a lot of it, where it was a little beyond autocomplete, and it didn't always give me what I wanted. Like, sometimes it was like, you are assuming that I am doing something wildly, drastically different from what I'm doing. But it was right often enough to where it was like, oh, okay, I definitely want this turned on.
And I think that's the thing. Like, in the early days, particularly. And I think maybe some people who tried stuff out too early have over-indexed on this. I think it was very personal in terms of like, what's the hit rate? Because, I mean, I find this with software engineers in general, right? Is there some software engineers I know who will completely genuinely, without any sense of irony, will express, but this only solves the customer problem 99% of the time, therefore it's pointless. If this is wrong 1% of the time, why would you ever do that? And it's like, well, actually, for most people, if this makes things 100 times faster, 99% of the time, which I'm not saying AI does, but like in some declarative software cases, things do, that's probably an enormous amount of business value for a lot of people, right?
Right.
But we have, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but we tend to have a streak as a, we're literally the people of zeros and ones, right? So it's like, we want things to be perfect. And when things aren't perfect, it's easy to kind of fall into the like, well, why did I bother? Like, what's the point?
Yeah.
And I definitely think those early LLMs, like the early Copilot, it's like the auto-completion was, if that's wrong 50% of the time, there's a lot of people who just find it really, really annoying. Whereas I'm the type of person.
But it sped me way up.
Exactly. Like, whereas I think I'm lazy enough that I'm like, if 50% of the time I can just like, I'm a reasonably fast typer. I was never one of those like hyper fast. I've switched to Dvorak because it gets me an extra 10 per second, whatever, like Vim keyboard warrior types. So for me, like, I'm like, oh yeah, like half as much typing some of the time is well worth it for me. Right. And I feel able to ignore the visual noise of it always trying to prompt me to do the wrong thing, right? And some people hate that, and I get it, right? But I guess I would say if you're one of those people that hated that in, maybe even 6 to 12 months ago, like, you should check back in because things are changing very fast, right?
Yeah. So kind of getting into the question that I'm asking, I'm enjoying this, right? I'm not saying you didn't get to the point.
No, of course.
What I'm saying is, so like this morning, right? Or last night, I think it was last night, I started it and then this morning I finished it. But, I'm expanding my podcast hosting system, which also does courses and summits and coaching and podcasts and screencasts, right? Because that's all stuff I want to offer off of the back of the podcasts, right? I was like, okay, well, I've got this multi-tenant setup going, and so I need people to be able to sign up, right? And actually pay me to use the system. And so I said, hey, I need a sign-up form. And I mean, it wrote all the views in Rails. It wrote all the management in the admin system. It wrote, and it basically worked. I mean, I had to tweak a couple of things because, it was like, okay, you got this wrong. And then when I asked it to do something else, it changed it back. And I had to go in and say, no, actually, you did it wrong the first time. But I mean, it would have taken me a day or so to figure out, to actually build it out on my own. Right. Go in and put everything together. It's all pretty basic stuff, but it just wrote it in like 20 minutes. Right. Yep. And then the tweaking took me probably another 45 minutes. And so I can see people looking at it and going, this thing is going to take my job.
Yep. And
So,
I understand why people think that. And I guess, like, to me, it would be when someone with your level of experience, Charles, is able to do that and there is zero tweaking. And like, I've done this 100 times in the last 2 weeks, and never at any point have I had to change a single character. Like, that would be when I would be more concerned about being like, well, maybe I still think the job of being a software engineer wouldn't go away in that case, because I think we are, even outside of programming, right? It was cooking some sweet potato in the air fryer yesterday, right? And my wife and I both use ChatGPT, and I transcribed it using voice. And she heard the way in which I speak to ChatGPT and the amount of context I gave it about, like, here's some facts about my particular sweet potato and how I like it. Here's some facts about my air fryer and whatever. And she was like, wow, like you said a lot of stuff there. Whereas I would just be like, cook sweet potato in air fryer, right? And the prompt she would get back would be pretty poor, and the prompt I get back is amazing, right? So, like, I guess some people talk about like prompt engineering or context engineering or whatever, but like, I think there's more to it than that. And I think there's a reason why the experts in prompt engineering or context engineering don't just happen to be like international tennis players or philosophers or whatever. Like, there's mostly software engineers, or at least software adjacent people, because like this is still talking to computers, and computers still like to be talked to in a, like, LLMs like to be talked to in a different way to, your CPU, but it's still sort of an art and a craft in that way. And like, I can definitely imagine almost the worst case scenario of when you're going to be writing a lot less code by hand than you ever were before. And for some people that really bums them out and freaks them out. But I still think that job of like, I take customer requirements and turn them into software, that's still a job, right? And that's still a hard job. And it's still a job that someone like yourself with a lot of experience, you are able to work with LLMs dramatically more effectively than a random person who started coding 2 months ago, right?
Yeah, I agree. There are a couple of things that you kind of talked through that I want to touch on. I mean, one of them is, you figure out essentially what context you have to give it, right? So you give it all of the information it needs so it can break it down and go, okay, this is what I'm working with. And then, it'll give you a much better response. One other thing that I've found that just kind of comes with experience with the LLMs is that, and this came up today, like I forgot to tell it, I'm not using Devise on my Rails app. And so it actually said, right, because I told it, I was like, you need to send an email confirmation when people sign up for the system, right? Not just a welcome email, because I need to confirm that their email works. And so it turned around and it said, I see that you're using Devise confirmable. And I immediately had to get in and stop it and say, I am not using Devise. Right. And then it did the right thing. And so, I had to remember that. And so some of that with the prompt engineering, you figure out what context it needs in order to make the right decision, and then you give it to it. And a lot of it too is just being thorough, right? So that it doesn't make any assumptions. I know we're kind of anthropomorphizing the LLM and it's just a predictive language model, but it doesn't make any assumptions on what you want. And so, some of it's going to just boil down to, I'm the human that's giving it a proper prompt that gives me better outputs. But the other thing is that, I still find that I have to tweak it, or at least I have to verify it, right? Even if I didn't have to touch it, I have to verify that it does the thing, right? I have to spin up my app and go and click through it, or if it's a CLI, I have to run it a couple of different ways to make sure that it's still doing what I want. And so there's that too. And then the last thing that I'm going to just point out is, like, I'm not seeing companies laying people off saying, well, we're using the LLMs to enhance the capabilities of our programmers, and so we don't need half of them anymore. We're not seeing that. What we're seeing is companies go, we can get 10 times the work done, or 5 times the work done, or double the work done by having the engineers that we have use the tools. And I think that just accelerates. And I think any company that's short-sighted enough to turn around and go, we're going to lay off half of our technical workforce, their competitors are going to come in and eat them alive.
I think that's, some people speculate that's the case. Some companies hint towards that being the case, but I don't think it's. I think what you are seeing, and again, I think if we're talking about things that you can be freaked out about, is like there's definitely been a big drop in hiring for juniors, right? Like there's measurable decrease in junior engineering positions. And I think there is this outstanding question of like, again, you and I have touched upon this already, right? Like I say in that post, one of the reasons why I talk about like why I think open source maintainers are well cut out for the LLM era, right? Is that conversation you mentioned before. If you were talking about building something an open source project, you could have equally been describing almost identically some contributor you've never worked with before, right? It's like, oh, wow, you know, I opened an issue and then overnight, some random person I never met before appeared. They made a PR, like it was mostly all right. I had to make some tweaks and then I merged it, right? Like, and I actually think the trust and verification process looks very similar, right? For someone like yourself, with a lot of experience, someone like me with a lot of experience, particularly if you have a lot of experience with one code base you've worked with for a long period of time, like you're able to provide probably very in-depth review of a relatively large amount of code in a very short amount of time in a way that makes these tools valuable to you, right? If you are unable to do that, either because you lack the experience, you lack the context with the code base, you lack the programming ability yourself, then all of a sudden you end up in this precarious position where it's like, okay, either I go at 100 miles an hour and like, if this stuff breaks, I won't know how to fix it. And I won't know even really how to describe to the LLM, like what's gone wrong beyond just copy pasting error messages. And when that fails, like I'm just shit out of luck, right? Or I slow down and I say, okay, I'm going to learn software the same way everyone learned software before LLMs, right? And then I have to kind of have a bit of the FOMO or even potentially my management chain being like, hey, all the seniors are like 25, 50% more productive now. Why aren't you? And it's, I'm glad I'm not responsible for social engineering or whatever, because like, I think that's a really hard question of like, what are we going to do as an industry? Because we can't just say we don't hire more juniors anymore because that's not going to work. But at the same time, I don't think we have a really good answer for like what those juniors should definitely do to skill up, right? Like it's hard.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think kind of reading between the lines on your blog post, it seems like part of the answer is having juniors or people who are at that level doing open source with it, right? Because then it's not, you don't have your boss or your company or the deadlines or things like that where people are going, why are you taking so long? And then the other thing is that if you do take the extra minute, even if you're still generating the code with AI, to then ask the LLM, okay, explain to me what you just did. Right. You can start to get context for what it did and why it did it. Now, it may not be giving you the best practice, but it's giving you at least some context for what it's working with. And in some cases, it is going to be best practice or at least common practice. So,
and you're seeing that even with LLMs now, right? Like the kind of study mode and ChatGPT and things like that, where like I played with that a little bit myself when I've been kind of trying to learn new things that I don't want to overly lean on the LLM. And, you know, it's kind of trying to do a bit of Socratic method stuff and all this sort of thing. But even with, I think it's a great point with open source where, you know, there's a bunch of talented Homebrew maintainers I know who are, in some cases, haven't had a tech job yet or still in college or relatively recently out of college. And like their code review abilities for typical expectations of like a new engineer are like completely off the charts. Like some of them are dramatically better at code review than I am, having done it, you know, probably 10 times as long as they have. But they've had a lot of experience doing this. And I think that might be part of the junior story, is that I think we sort of had a little bit of an attitude, I think, for a while, at least in some cultures of companies I've seen, where it's like, well, okay, we'll get everyone to review a bit of code, but really like the more senior people are going to be more responsible for doing the more in-depth, hardcore code review of like gnarly stuff, right? And that might be the culture that needs to change, but we're actually like, okay, rather than saying to the juniors, like, hey, you just spend 95% of your time coding, don't worry about this code review stuff too much. You'll figure it out as you go along. Maybe we need to flip it around and be like, actually, you should spend 95% of your time doing code review. And Don't worry about this coding stuff too much. If you read enough of other people's code, you're going to figure that out, right? And maybe that's where we go. And certainly that would be an attitude that would make you more qualified with working with LLMs better, for sure.
Right. You brought up code reviews, and that kind of reminded me of another thing, since we're talking about AI and things like that. So yesterday I put in a PR at work, and I asked some folks to review it, and I got on this morning and it still hadn't been reviewed. Whenever people get in and they see the message, I'm sure it'll get done. But anyway, when I checked it, GitHub asked me if I wanted Copilot to review my PR. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I've actually at Workbrew and now at Homebrew and some companies I've done contracting with have enabled. In fact, I don't know if I've done this on Homebrew actually, but basically whenever I can, I enable Copilot review of PRs by default. And I think
it good?
It's sort of. So it has definitely caught a bunch of stuff that humans have not caught on my PRs. Again, the false positive rate is like pretty high, but if what you're concerned about is like, hey, I want to make sure that someone is going to catch my typos. Again, like another blog post I wrote a long time ago, and at this time, this was 2018 or something, so we weren't even talking about AI and LLMs, but I think it still kind of holds up. Is I wrote about I called it like robot pedantry, human empathy, basically. And what I compared in that post was like, on the one side, like people are like Rubicop, you can set to be like hyper anal, right? And like really, really pedantic. And people could actually be fairly tolerant of that. I actually quite like that when it's dialed up to 11 like that. But if you as a human give the same code review feedback as a Rubicop up to 11, all your coworkers will hate you.
Yeah.
Often, even if you have agreed on these coding guidelines as a group or whatever, there's something about like that level of pedantry about like if someone typo something 10 times, going through and every single time being like typo, 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 even if you use the GitHub suggestion, so it's one click for them to fix it. Like people don't like that. They really hate it when humans do that to them. But that's the expectation that robots will do that. So that's one thing I found is like useful on that side. But then again, like I said in that post, so part of why I wrote the post at the time is like there'd been more and more moved to kind of like automation and stuff like that, which I thought was really healthy and like CI. But you were starting to see people being like, oh, the first time someone makes a pull request on my repo, we should congratulate that person. So let's write a bot to congratulate them. And I remember talking to a bunch of people and they were saying like, yeah, it feels completely meaningless when a bot says, well done, good job, you're a rock star now. It's like, it's like, so I'm in some empty room by myself and, over the tannoy came a robotic voice saying, you are great. It's like, whereas if a human says to you, hey, well done, like, I'm pumped that you're here, like that actually has an impact. So and I think this is the same thing with kind of code review and Copilot and these tools and whatever now. It's just like, like Copilot can give you a review where it points out your typos more effectively than a human can, but Copilot can't say, wow, that was really cool. Like you solved this in half the lines of code I thought is possible. Like this is a really elegant solution. Great job, right? Like, and that's, again, much as like the stuff about humans and jobs and whatever, right? Like most of us are probably not going to be okay with spending 40 hours a week exclusively communicating to an LLM. Like we want to deal with humans who say nice things that they actually mean that are not in the prompt, right? Like, and that does have more of an impact. And I feel the same way with like code review, where it's like these are complementary tools, and the human code review and the AI code review are sort of doing different things, but I'm glad that they're both there. And I wouldn't use one to entirely replace the other.
So I guess the other question that I was asking is, what AI tools are you using these days?
Yeah. So for me, I'm mainly using like Cursor as my kind of in-editor, like code completion thing, and like their agent mode kind of sporadically. But again, I use it kind of in the in-editor fashion. I still use ChatGPT mainly for stuff where I'm just like asking it things where I'm going to probably write the code myself or with a bit of help from Cursor, but like I basically use that instead of Google. And then the thing that has been interesting to me recently is, so I started, everyone was being like, all my kind of AI forward friends were like, oh, you need to use Claude Code. So signed up, played around Claude Code. I was like, okay, this is quite good. I can see the appeal. But I think just because I'm an open source maintainer, like there's this GitHub agent PR thing where you can now, if you have Copilot for your organization or whatever. I'm not quite sure how the pricing and the enabling works or whatever, but it works on Homebrew essentially. So what you can do is you can just assign an issue to Copilot, and then it will just open a PR that's like, okay, I've tried to solve this issue for you, right? And this is good that we're having this conversation today because it's fairly timely, because in the last week, Homebrew had, I think, 8 open bugs on the main kind of package manager repo that I review everything on. I was like, I'm just going to assign all of them to Copilot and see what happens, right? And it's similar to the thing you described earlier, right? Where it was like, in a couple of cases, it was like literally spot on first time.
Mm-hmm.
In most of the cases, it required me to do the last like 10% of the code.
Right.
And then in a couple of cases, it was like 25% of the way there, pretty broken. I had to have quite a bit of back and forth. I ended up kind of rewriting half of it myself. But even in there, it sort of solved the empty page problem for me. And I think it's just something about me as like an open source maintainer that it feels good and nice to just be like, assign issue, PR, review PR, check out PR to finish it off, merge PR. And like, that's the flow instead of like this thing that lives in my terminal that I need to check and whatever.
Yeah, I like you brought up the empty page situation. That's a really good way of putting, right? Because I'll sit there and, how do I need to put this? Okay, and then I kind of have an idea of how I want it to go. And so I start kind of fiddling with it, right? And instead I can prompt the AI. This is what I'm building. And sometimes I'll ask, how should I start? And sometimes I'll just tell it to go for it.
Yeah.
And
I'm sure you found this as well. That like sometimes when it's completely wrong.
Yeah.
You probably heard that, like, I can't remember who said this ages ago, that like the quickest way to get a Stack Overflow answer is to answer your own question with the wrong answer.
Yeah.
Right? And then everyone will jump in and be like, no, that person's wrong. Let me tell you how it actually is. Sometimes I feel like the same way with the LLM stuff, where I'm like, sometimes it goes off and it does something completely fucking terrible. And I'm like, no, that's not how you do it. You obviously do it like this. And I'm like, oh, I figured out how to do it.
Well, what's funny is that there were a couple of things that I was working on with because I'm using Cursor in agent mode. The main reason is because my employer provides us with credits on Copilot. On VS Code, which is what I kind of gotten used to. But I don't want to use Works Copilot credits on my personal stuff. And so I use Cursor for my personal stuff and Copilot for their stuff, because I'm using the same GitHub account for both. And so anyway, there have been a couple of times where I've told it to do something and it sits there and it flails, right? It's like, I'm going to do this. Oh, wait, I think I have a better approach. So I'm going to delete everything I just did and do it this way. And it'll do like 2 or 3 things. And I'll finally just step in and say, I've been watching you and actually I just want you to do it this way. And it'll just turn around. That, of course, it tells me I'm smart for saying that, right? And then again, it's like, you're a machine, you know, but do it my way. And and so just because it gets it wrong doesn't mean that it can't get it right if you give it just a little more direction.
And to just speculate widely for a minute, I also have a hypothesis that maybe the reason why junior hiring could be down is the people who were previously responsible for mentoring those juniors are now essentially mentoring their LLMs. Because like, again, that flow you described earlier about like with Rails and they thought I was using Devise and I wasn't, like that again, 10 years ago, you could have described some new talented junior person that you hired, right? And oh wow, they saved me so much time and I had to do the last little bit to help them over the line and whatever. Like I think the flow and also like the stuff you like and the stuff that's really frustrating and exhausting about it is kind of the same. And I personally couldn't imagine a day where I spend half my day supervising agentic AI workflows and then the other half doing the same thing with like junior folks who are struggling in the same way. Or the worst of both worlds, which we're seeing in open source now, which is someone who is junior, who is trying to use an AI agent to create a pull request. And obviously you can't really prove this, but like I had a PR today where each round of review, they were responding and then they would paste something into an issue comment with like the /n characters in there rather than new lines, which makes it look like it was automated. And then I'd be like, give them a bunch of comments, but then one of the comments would be like, hey, like you've added 2 extra options to the CLI. which one of those are you using? Do you need both this functionality or just the functionality for one? Because if we just need the functionality, if you only you need for one, and they would just completely ignore those questions and just turn it into more code. And it had that AI feel that I'm sure you're familiar with, Charles, of just like more code every time. Every time the solution is, we're just going to add more code, right? And it got to the point where I was like, I'm just speaking to someone's Claude code through if I wanted that, I would be using Claude code myself. So I couldn't prove it, but I just closed the PR because I was like, sorry, feels like I'm speaking to an AI, not human. And I thought to myself, I'll probably just assign this issue to Copilot later and see how it does. And it's probably going to be easier than what we're doing right now.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I've got to start wrapping up. So let's go ahead and do some picks and then we'll call it good. Before we do that, if people want to connect with you, if they have questions about Homebrew or it sounds like you help people out for hire, or at least you used to. So if there's a place for people to hire you, I'd love to have that too. But yeah, how do people connect with you on any of those levels?
Yeah, sure. Best place for me is my website at mikemcquaid.com. If you go there, that's got links to all my social media. It's got all my email. It's got talks or articles and all this type of stuff. Anything you might want to know about me, that's basically the best kickoff point there.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks. I will get us started. Boy, it's been a while since I've done this. I'm trying to think of what games I've been playing lately. Here's one that I'll do. So I don't know if you do board games much, but
yeah, I do a little, not a huge amount.
Have you ever played?
Again, like a couple of times. I've never been a DM or anything like that.
Okay. So there's a game out there called Betrayal at House on the Hill. And I think that there's a book or a movie or something related to it. Anyway, essentially you take your Scooby-Doo gang into a haunted house and you go explore the house until the haunt starts. And then one of you becomes the traitor. And so then it's the traitor against the explorers until one of you wins, right? And so it gives you, and there are two books. There's the Traitor's Tome and there's the Explorer's Manual. And so the Explorer's Manual explains to them how they win, and the Traitor's Tome explains to the traitor how they win. And the reason there are two books is because there are some things that the traitor has to know that the explorers don't need to know, or it'd help them win if they knew. Anyway, so it does that. Well, there's a version of this called Betrayal at Baldur's Gate. And Baldur's Gate there's a video game, Baldur's Gate, but Baldur's Gate is a D&D location. And so if you ever look at anything that's Baldur's Gate, you'll notice it's Wizards of the Coast, which is the company that does D&D. And so anyway, so Betrayal at Baldur's Gate is Betrayal at House on the Hill with the D&D elements from Baldur's Gate. And so instead of exploring rooms, you're exploring areas, and you have the cities, like the streets, you have indoor areas, and then you've got the catacombs underneath the city. And so you can kind of explore whatever you want. And there are some differences, but yeah, the rest of the elements are the same. And so if you're kind of like that, it doesn't have like strong story elements. It really is just an explore and then, fight off the monsters game. But it's fun. And I played it with my guys group a couple weeks ago. Board Game Geek weights it at 5.6. So, your casual gamers, it's mildly complicated, but not so complicated that, folks that just like a casual board game among friends wouldn't just pick it up.
Nice.
So
cool.
I'm gonna pick that up, or I'm gonna pick that. It came out in 2017. I don't know if it's still in print. That's the only caveat I have on that. And then on the other picks, I've really gotten into using the agent mode on Cursor. And so I'm going to pick that as well. Incidentally, I was just kind of goofing around and I thought, okay, well, how much work would it be to get it to essentially vibe code a React Native app, a podcast subscription app? And I have to say that it did pretty good. It doesn't have all the features I want in it yet, but it's good enough to where I'm starting to think about whether or not I actually want to release the sucker onto the app stores. And so, and I'm not a React Native developer by any means, though. Again, that's another technology I want to pick up because we use it at work. So anyway, So I'm gonna pick that as well. And then within React Native, I'm using Expo. Yeah.
Very cool.
But yeah, Mike, what picks do you have?
Yeah, so I guess my game-related pick would probably be Avowed. So that was recommended to me by, don't know if he's been on this pod before, but certainly legend of the Ruby community, Justin Searles.
Oh, yeah.
It's sort of like, you know, it's made by Obsidian. It's like a kind of Bethesda-esque, like story-driven RPG. And it's just, I don't know, like if you liked all those old school RPGs like Oblivion and Skyrim and whatever, it's got that vibe, but like lots of nice like quality of life things. Like, so if a character ever uses a sort of bit of jargon, you can just press a button and then a glossary pops up that sort of defines the specific bit of jargon they use. And I'm like, yeah, I want this in every RPG now. And like, you know, if you're a mage, you have a wand that casts stuff and it doesn't require mana, and you know, like lots of just like little things that have annoyed me in other games. So yeah, I'm enjoying just exploring that. I imagine it's one of those games I'm probably going to 100% just because like the world is interesting enough.
Yeah. What's it called again?
It's called Avowed, Avowed. And then I guess if you're not a gamer, like TV wise, we've been watching Tokyo Vice, which is pretty interesting, about this guy who's a journalist and kind of lots of stuff with like organized crime in Japan. That's I can't remember what network it's on or whatever, but that's been good. Certainly 2 seasons of that. We're about halfway through the 2nd season, enjoying that a lot. And then I guess on the computer land, I guess, yeah, I mentioned it already, but I would probably say the Copilot agent mode, where you can assign it an issue and it will then create a PR. There's a bunch of rough edges there, but there's something about the workflow that feels pretty different to like running agents locally, and has a different trust model in a good way, in that like you can let it just run arbitrary commands and it's running in some random Docker container and GitHub's infrastructure that you don't care about compared to your local machine. But yeah, but if you're someone who lives in PRs all of the time, then it might be worth seeing if that's an agent flow that works for you more than like some terminal app or some window in your IDE or whatever.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always a fun time.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. Till next time, folks, Max out.